morning, David.
Good morning, Jessica. How are you today?
I'm very well. How are you?
Excellent, actually.
It's good to
Take
see
those
your
off.
logo behind you, the weapon of mass creation.
That's my thing.
Yeah, I do remember commenting on it last year, and yeah, it's nice and bright.
Yeah, nothing's changed.
Well, I'm sure a lot has changed.
Wow,
We can't have gone through the last 18 months without a lot of things changing around us, if not within us. So,
true.
and we all have a story around it.
That we do. That we do.
Yeah. So, David, so this year the theme of the conference is stories and the impact stories have, and there are many different ways of talking about stories, because there's the story that we create. You are passionate about creativity, so I know that you'll probably agree with me that we create our own stories to a large extent, don't we?
Yep.
That's one way of looking at it. And then the other thing is, like, there are other people's stories that influence us, that we allow to influence us, that we allow to shape our behavior and our values even. And then there are the stories that we co-create with others. We choose people that we want to create a story with. So for you, what is the importance of stories in your work, and how have stories influenced you?
Right. Story is immensely important because, I mean, literally, we tend to narrate our existence on one level or another. When you are busy with anything, you're also thinking about what you're doing. You're also narrating what you're doing. And, all the research and the investigation that's been done over the years points to the fact that quite often our consciousness is a bit of a passenger in terms of what is happening. And we are generating this story about what is happening to us, around us, and with us. And I think until quite recently, with the exception possibly of more esoteric circles, there was this idea that that wasn't something you could have any control over. But with the emergence of things like narrative therapy and storytelling, and increasingly on a corporate level, the whole notion of what a story is, and the fact that the teller chooses where the story goes, I think a lot of people are suddenly understanding that actually our responses are quite often a story. Because X and Y happened to me in the past, I am now this kind of person, which means I have to react in way A, B, and C. And we come to identify very closely with those stories, such that quite often, if we are challenged on that, we become quite resentful, because now you're challenging who and what I am, which calls into question what I've been through and the validity of it and how I am now reacting to it. And actually, all of that is a choice. We literally create the story, because really what happens to us, you could just see as data points, as information. And we weave those together with a narrative.
Yeah.
And it's astonishing how so many people can experience the same events and come up with totally different stories. I was the victim, I've been repressed, I've been hurt, there was evil intent, to I'm the winner, I went through hard times, I learned so much, and now I'm in control of my destiny. And it seems that we have a predilection one way or the other. And the concerning part is that quite often these stories become so well established in our minds that they kind of take over. So we run it like a pattern. So quite often people are not even really consciously engaging with stimulus anymore. It's like, well, the story goes like this, so when X happens, I react like this, boom. It becomes quite black and white, and it's really restricting for growth.
Yes, and I suppose the key word, as you say, is choice. It's knowing that, yes, we are part of a story. We may have a role in a story, but the role is not who we are entirely. The role is,
Right.
we can change roles. In
Yeah.
a film, in a story, in any story, if that story is placed in a different context, the background, the landscape, the setting will all change, and it will form a different story, and it'll be our choice whether we remain in that story or choose to step into a different one. So I suppose it's this over identification with the story, not realizing that the story is not entirely who we are.
Right. And then that's why I find creativity and creative thinking skills so empowering and important for personal freedom. Because if you think creatively, the first thing you have to ask yourself is why, or is that true, or what if it was different? And by asking those questions, you cast the narrative into a bit of doubt, and then suddenly you've got options. And if you have options, then you have a choice. And when you make a choice, you seize control. And so the first step of that is to step into a what if state, into the ambiguity of the situation, instead of just accepting a black and white narrative. So, storytelling, I mean, it's actually kind of crazy. Again, the studies have shown how much better we learn when what we seek to learn is couched in a story. Our retention rates are far better than just facts listed. As soon as it's woven into a tale, we retain it. We're drawn to story. And it is massively persuasive and powerful in the way our consciousness works. Unfortunately, I think what that leads to sometimes is mistaking, like you say, people kind of mistake the story as themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So we have to, like, when we are learning, we have to see ourselves in the story in some way. And I suppose the power of the story is that the story can be interpreted to suit our own interest, to suit, for them to be like a mirror, uniquely reflecting who we are and what our context is, and the meaning it has to us. So in a room full of 100 people, you tell a story and there will be 100 interpretations of what you've just said.
Exactly. I mean, that's the whole postmodernist canon, isn't it? As a writer, for example, the moment you put a story out into the world, you lose control over what it means, because the meaning is generated at the intersection of your story and whoever reads its story. And it's not so much that we can project it, it's that we do, and we do actually project our story. It's essentially a random narrative. If you look at the dots, they could be joined in any number of combinations, but for whatever reason, we choose to join it in this way, and then kind of start behaving as if that's the only possible way. Whereas, the whole postmodernist theory is that in actual fact, that is totally not true. So much so that it's not even entirely clear what the author meant when they told the story. That meaning emerges.
Yeah, that's right. The author may have had a particular intention when they wrote the story, but 2 days later, we change, don't we?
Right.
And what we meant may be different a week later or a year later. And there have been many cases where we may regret something that we said a year back because we've just moved on from that. We didn't right. notice, because I suppose that's the co-creation part of the story. It's that it's not simply our own story. It's like, how does that story involve others, and what is the impact of our story on the stories of other people, because they are intertwined.
Yeah. And it's, recently various celebrities, sports people and politicians and so on have been exposed for previous prejudiced tweets or social media posts of some nature or other, like something that was racist or sexist or just generally bigoted or what have you. And this is now 10 years later, and they're being held to that story. Because you told that story then, you are this kind of person now. And yeah, I mean, that's a fairly compelling line of thought, isn't it? And most of us would assume that that's probably still true. But that completely disregards the idea that as a person grows, literally older day by day, and experiences more, that their story changes, and that they indeed are ashamed of the story they once told. It's a bit like the right to be forgotten on internet search engines. Do we have the right to have our old stories forgotten because we've moved on and changed? And I think sometimes, because society at large is a little bit overly well bonded to personal stories, we're reluctant to let other people loose from their old stories and allow them to embody their new.
Well, the thing is that when a story is written down, it kind of immortalizes it in a way that Whereas before, when stories were told orally, the stories would naturally evolve over the centuries. But now, like if we read a Rudyard Kipling or a Roald Dahl book, they are set in stone, I suppose, you know.
Yes.
and and when we read them, it's like we notice the insensitivities, which, you know, for the current day and age, it's like they are obvious. Whereas when they wrote those stories, they were writing for a different audience. And so that's the thing about written stories, as opposed to a moving, shifting oral tradition where the storyteller is responding to the actual real audience in front of them, rather than people across the world that they will never ever meet.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
You know, because you know what it makes me think of is I think most people approach social media as if it's an oral story. It's spontaneous, it's in the flow, it's part of an emerging narrative, but it's written down. And therefore it is immortalized. And so things that you've done and said in the past do come and trip you up if you happen to stick your head up above the herd. Is that a good thing? I'm not sure.
And even if it's not written down, it's you know, like a video recording like this, it's still immortalized, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like so whether it's video or podcast or the written word or symbols, even they don't have the adaptability to, you know, to change what the message is based on who the audience is. Because the thing is that with social media, most of the time we don't know who the audience is. We will never ever meet them.
No, thanks to the algorithms, you know, it's I mean, is there actually an audience anymore if you're not paying? But that's a whole other debate. Yeah.
And then let's talk about values then, because stories can be interpreted, you know, a thousandfold. And values, are values inherent in stories? Are they values that are innate to us? Are we born with the values that we hold most dearly, or are values shaped through conditioning, through social conditioning and the stories that we're exposed to?
Biologically, we're hardwired to achieve consciousness, which means to a certain extent that we are always going to have a perspective, which is probably the base level for what we might call values. So we're hardwired to have values, I do believe. But the ultimate expression of those values is going to differ depending on your upbringing. It's a bit like language. You know, human beings are hardwired to speak a language. But if you take a baby born in China and raise it in America, it's going to speak native language English. It's going to have no connection to the Chinese language, and vice versa. And I think values are a bit the same. You know, values are essentially a way of filtering our experience by attaching to a certain, you know, kind of, what could you call them? Anchors in the world. And I think that, again, we possibly over-identify with values. And where story gets so important with values is that we, you know, the stories we tell, if we wish to portray certain values, need to be consistent and consistent over time. So to refer back to the example of, you know, celebrities being outed for previous racist attitudes, the intelligent thing to do would be to look at their narrative over a period of time and to see if there was regret expressed, retractions, change, and that value was no longer being expressed in their story. Because of course it's easy to just deny it because, well, you know, I'm now famous and I'm making money and I want to stay here. But is the ongoing expression of their story still manifesting that value? And I think that's where story and value becomes so important. You know, the story is the living embodiment of the values that you purport to stand for.
And there's a very strong relationship between values and behavior, isn't there? That if we are behaving in a way and our values are not in alignment with that behavior, it's usually obvious that there is a lack of integrity. Like people will say that they're not racist, but their behavior demonstrates that, you know, something very different. And we know
it's true, but popular politics is demonstrating that nobody cares about that anymore. You know, if we look at the recent political history across the Western world, people have quite obviously acted in undemocratic, bigoted, anti-free will, anti-free determination ways, and yet people are still voting for them because they think they are actually manifesting those things. And so the whole cultural story is getting very tangled up in the expression of personal values via story. So I don't think it's quite as clear cut as you're saying there anymore. I mean, I think that was always the idea, this whole notion of having honor and integrity. You didn't say you had those things. People said it about you because it was manifested in your actions. That I don't believe is true anymore.
And nowadays, it's especially like with globalization and with social media, we may find that our shared values, like we can find people in very remote cultures who have more alignment in terms of our own values compared with our own families even, or the people that we're voting for. So there seems to be something which is transcendental about values, that there are values, but we might not necessarily find those values being shared in our local environment.
Yeah, well, I mean, I believe that values are essentially social constructs. And because they are expressed according to socialization, it's not always obvious when they are shared. And we can get quite caught up in the cultural difference as opposed to the value difference. And I think that's where it gets really interesting. And it's the global contact that is possible through mediums like this is what really makes life interesting, because indeed you suddenly find yourself short-circuiting culture and relating to someone based on value, because you can see it expressed in their actions. And I fear that we have become a little bit too preoccupied with the story, with the verbal, with the written word as a demonstration of someone's identification with value, rather than looking at their actual actions. Because if you look at the actual actions, you've got to experience cognitive dissonance. So much of what's happened has been said, it's about this, it's about making things better and greater and more wonderful and independence, and then you look at the consequence, it's completely the opposite of that, and yet people still believe in the story. And there should be massive cognitive dissonance, but there isn't. And for me, the huge question is, why not?
Well, as you know, I'm based in Britain, and in Britain we have this strong in education, we are obliged to teach British values. It's mandatory, it's fundamental for all state-funded education. We have to teach British values, and British values are tolerance, individual liberty, rule of law, democracy. And this question of individual liberty, not every culture believes in the value of individual liberty. And now we're, through this coronavirus pandemic, it's like individual liberty in terms of who wants to be vaccinated and who doesn't want to be vaccinated. We feel like, well, those are the values that we've been espousing, and this freedom of choice, this individual liberty to make fundamental decisions about whether you want to be vaccinated or whether you don't want to be vaccinated, it seems to be in contradiction to the value that we've been inculcating.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as someone who was born in Britain myself, I think the unfortunate position of that is that, the recent history of the United Kingdom doesn't really espouse any of those values either. Empire, colonial times, Brexit, national chauvinism, outright racism. A lot of that kind of fair play, equal access is only good for a certain class of person. The fact that half of the British Parliament is an unelected body is also not entirely democratic. So it doesn't surprise me that the general man on the street is no longer really buying into the whole package, because the whole package is not entirely what it makes itself out to be.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what we know, you being a coach, you know about the power of stories, and all the research that's gone around the relationships between our behavior and our values and whatever. But what is it that we still don't know about the impact of stories? What is it that we still need to be researching, still need to be exploring and finding out more about?
I think the big question that remains is why? I mean, why does it have this enormous impact? Is this a function of how we are conscious or self-conscious of our actual awareness of the world? The interface that is our brain, is it a function of how that actually interprets the stimuli that comes in? Or is it some kind of deep-seated cultural habit that has emerged once language was acquired? Because initially it was the only way to transmit knowledge. I think the undeniable and ongoing power of story is something that hasn't quite been explained. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to dive into on many levels, on a cultural level, on a neurological, biological level, and others. It remains fascinating to me how it is even possible for people to rearrange all of the data points into different narratives. And even people with no cultural or value difference can still come up with very different stories about indisputable facts. And I guess, the existentialist in me says, well, that's inevitable. We're locked up in in the jails of our skulls, and all we have access to are these 5 sensory points, and they're literally on a direct experiential level is nothing else. And therefore we spin stories, and that is the filter through which we experience the world. Without it, could we actually say we have an experience? I mean, if there isn't a story, have you experienced anything?
And I suppose there's, you talk about being existentialist, and that story is very different to somebody who is very religious. It's a very, very different story. And I suppose the fact that you, like a very religious person who believes in heaven or hell, or believes in eternal life, or the Buddhist kind of beliefs, they all have a very different story about where we come from, the origin story, and where we're going. And I suppose that, like, being an existentialist, this beginning and ending, like the story, is it a never-ending story that is constantly evolving, or is it a story that will come to a dramatic end?
Well, while it's still going, it's evolving, but it will end, yes. I think it's important also, not to confuse existentialism with nihilism. As an existentialist, my fundamental belief is that there is no freestanding meaning out there in the world. It is only through my interaction with the world that I'm able to generate meaning for myself. The bigger question of what happens next is not necessarily determined by that point of view.
Yeah, because I don't believe that the story will ever end. You see, so like that's a different perspective. It's like, for me, the story is always continuing because I believe in reincarnation. So for me, it's like, it's always like, even time, like time, I don't believe in linear time. I believe that time is
I think science has proved it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
No, so again, you see, this is where it's quite interesting, because there's a story about existentialism, which is very rooted in, Sartre and Camus, and it's all very depressing, and there is no God, and we're all going to die, and it's all meaningless and dreary and dull. My take on it is rather that it's because there is no meaning and there is no God. It is all. It's totally up to you. You can do whatever you want, which I find extremely liberating and empowering. However, what we are is a form of energy. Matter vibrates at a certain frequency, and gas and liquids, and it's all different. And, energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. So in a weird way, even as an existentialist, I'm with you. I'm like, I don't think the story ever ends. I think the wheel continues to turn. But I have serious doubts about the expressions of how that manifests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if energy can't be destroyed, it simply transforms. It's like in our DNA, in our, all the cells in our bodies, like there were probably cells in other people's bodies at some point.
Yeah, we're all stardust.
Yeah, that's a good story. So is there anything else that you think that we need to be kind of focusing on in terms of discussing and debating about the mystery of stories and creativity?
For me, step one is always to release our judgments and our opinions and step into the ambiguity and the vagary so that other options can be explored. You mentioned people of particular religious convictions quite often find that difficult to do because there can only be one truth. But what could be more empowering than letting go of all of that certainty, stepping into the ambiguity, and then stepping out the other side with those convictions intact? I think that would make one a far more secure believer than never having done that. And I think it's the same with any story. Yeah, maybe you're going to discover something else and your story will change, but maybe you won't. Maybe you'll come back and say, wow, actually, this is congruent. This story does gel with how, with myself, with how I choose to act, with my values, with my expression. And yes, I see there are other options, but do I want to change? Actually not. I'm good with this. And I think that's also extraordinarily powerful.
Yeah, I think with very good education, with high quality education, it's this learning to take on different perspectives and be critical and at the same time be quite confident in what we believe based on our own values. But I love talking with people who have very different values to myself, or values, as we've said before, like there are shared values and there are values that we don't prioritize. For example, for some people, the value of loyalty may be very high priority, and for somebody else, freedom might be more important than loyalty. So we do choose our values, but at the same time, like being in conversation with somebody who has a totally different perspective and viewpoint, that building bridges, it enhances our experience, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If the whole world was white, as in literally painted white, we would have a very boring experience. And yet, culturally speaking, quite often, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to paint the whole world white. And it's self-defeating and stupid, but that's kind of quite often how cultural expressions take place. They're just kind of almost proselytizing and trying to convert everything instead of just going, wow, look at that. That's different. That's interesting. Because these differences spark stuff in us, which make us do new and different things. And I guess we don't really want people to be too new and different, because then they don't fit on the factory assembly line anymore and the bosses don't know what to do with you. It just causes ructions. But I'm a firm believer that right now we need ructions. We need to change the way we're doing stuff. You just look at the new UN climate report. You just look at how we're just not eradicating poverty. You look at how globally women are still so much second-class citizens. You're kind of going, this is just nuts. We can send people to planets, outside of our world, but we're still treating each other like absolute dirt. What happened to the, looking after your brother? And again, that's also this massive cognitive dissonance, because if you look at all cultural values, it's always about community, about our people, and we're together, and until it comes to actually like looking after them. And why are we comfortable with that? We shouldn't be.
Well, again, it's like the values. Some people value self-sufficiency. They believe that every individual needs to be able to look after themselves, and rather than the value of like taking care of the other. And I suppose this is the distinction between left wing and right wing, isn't it? The left wing politics, it's like we have to take care of the vulnerable, and the right wing, it's like, no, we have to take care of like the survival of the fittest, basically, and we have to take care of the economy and let it filter down.
Yeah, and so it's a meritocracy. If you don't work hard, you don't deserve anything.
Yes.
Yeah, which is a massive cultural projection and assumption, which is flawed, as we can see. I saw a lovely meme come drifting past on Facebook this week, which was a screenshot of a Monopoly board. and monopoly is supposed to be the ultimate expression of capitalism in action. And yet, every time you go around the board, you get given $200. There's a social grant underpinning the effectiveness of monopoly. And I think that's quite often what that particular individualist right-wing ideology conveniently overlooks, is that in order to be able to think like that, and you have to be held up somehow. And quite often it's through structural racism and built-in inequalities. Capitalism couldn't exist if there weren't poor people who would work for less than $1 a day to make your running shoes. So actually, it's just a lie.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just so true. And I suppose that with egalitarianism, that in itself, when there have been revolutions to try and resolve the balance, and they have created problems of their own.
Yeah. I mean, communism, woo, has failed. That's the line. It's like, well, capitalism has as well. Capitalism just hasn't died yet. And there's got to be something beyond all of that. And my fervent hope is that our human ingenuity and creativity will find a solution. I mean, I think AI and liberating human beings from drudge work is the first step. But the second step is going to be making sure that those who have don't dominate all of that, so that when people don't have drudge work anymore and there is no other work, that they are still looked after.
I'm hearing more and more about the concept of shareism, like sharing.
Yeah.
And like even this, even the conferences, it's like sharing ideas, sharing information, rather than capitalizing, commercializing ideas, commercializing everything that we do. And like platforms, online platforms, Zoom, for example, a lot of it starts off with sharing, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I relate that to the difference between, everyone likes to shout about what their rights are, but not enough people are shouting about what their responsibilities are. And you can't have rights without responsibilities. If you want a right to self-determination, whatever, you've got to pay your taxes. And you've got to take part in the democratic process. And and people are so like, oh, I can do whatever I want, but they're not prepared to fulfill their social responsibilities, the rest of the contract, which guarantees you those rights. And that imbalance is also part of the problem.
And also this kind of a culture of like being generous, voluntarily being generous. So even like paying taxes is compulsory, but being generous, doing things for others, even though no one is forcing you or compelling you or obliging you to.
Yeah, it's my favorite trick was always toll roads. Is pull up, pay your toll, and before they were all automated, tell the person behind the till there, and I'm paying for the guy behind me. Even if you don't know who they are, just because, well, why not?
Well, that reminds me of something that I've heard, and this makes a lot of sense, is that countries that are built on trust and honesty, like are obviously more civilized, more evolved than countries where everything has to be controlled and monitored. So, for example, when I go to the local supermarket, they actually trust me to scan my own shopping, and that can only happen where trust is a high priority, and we've actually demonstrated credibility that we are trustworthy. In some countries, I don't think I would be trusted to scan my own shopping and
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that in those countries there would be a massive imbalance between rich and poor. So you would have a whole bunch of people who are too desperate to adhere to that trust contract.
I've actually been in, I think, at least 2 countries where on entering a supermarket or a shop, I've had to leave my bag at the entrance.
Yep, I've experienced that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So compare that with being able to scan my own shopping, and just like have no one there checking if I've paid for every single thing, so compare that. That is the difference between like values and how we're behaving in alignment with the values that we espouse, like trust and honesty, integrity.
Yeah, true. You are, because you're in a position to be able to do that, because structurally that's facilitated for you. And that's just not always true. You know, other countries have huge structural problems in that regard. So it's simply not possible. Whether the people are trustworthy or not is moot. The situation is not conducive.
Well, the irony is that one of the countries where I had to leave my bag at the entrance is Cuba, which is a communist country. So you would expect there to be more equality.
That's not what history tells us.
That's what, that's what that great revolution was meant to be for. And it's ironic that at the end of it, it's like, well, there's without trust, how can a society flourish?
Yeah, and again, I keep on using the term social contract, and I think that's part of it. I think people look at what politicians are doing and they don't trust them anymore. So the contract is broken. And then it manifests lower down the chain as well.
So, yeah, absolutely. So there's just so much more that we could be talking about, but I think we've covered a lot of ground already, and it's been very refreshing to hear your points of view on this. You've obviously done a lot of research on this whole kind of aspect and the way you use it in your work. It's so stories are inherent in the way you how do you, like, in terms of your professional work, how are stories a part of that?
Well, I use stories in order to encourage people to envisage a different future. Mm-hmm. So by putting them into a space where they can freely, essentially fantasize. So you say things like, if you had all the money and all the opportunities and all the skills and all the support that you needed, ideally, what would you do? And then tell me the story of what that would look like and how do you get there? And then, okay, so here you are, there's the story. How do you get there? And then, using our capacity to imagine and to plan and to predict, build a story. Because, your 5-year plan is just a story. Your ambition to become CEO is just a story. At some stage, you conceived of that notion of the narrative ending there. And now you're busy with the steps that you created. So in that way, story is very important to what I do. None the least, getting people to take their hands off the steering wheel of the current story long enough to see the other options.
Excellent. Well, that sounds fascinating, David. And yeah, I will speak with you again very soon. But I think we've covered a lot of ground already in this conversation.
Cool. Thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. I'll speak with you soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye.